Hello and welcome to another exciting DrakeU video. Today we're going to be talking about one of my all-time favorite pet peeve, which is filtering. And one of the reasons why I like talking about filtering is, for the most part, a lot of aspiring writers have never even heard of this term. Which is a shame because A, it really does rot your story out from the inside. It just really ruins the immersion of it, the readability of it, the enjoyment of it. But unfortunately, it's pretty invisible. Most people don't even see it, don't even notice it until it's actually brought to their attention. So if that's the case, if it's invisible, why even worry about it? Because yes, while it's invisible, the reading is less because it's there. So at the end of this, we're going to look at a couple samples of my writing and we're going to look at it with filtering and without. And while both read fine, hopefully you'll see that the one without filtering reads much, much better, is more immersive, more dynamic, more enjoyable. And that's really what we want our readers to experience to begin with, right? And the best thing about it is once you really understand it and once you learn it and know how to avoid it in your writing, it really is very simple to keep out of your writing, which is nice because let's face it, there's a lot that you have to learn to be a good professional creative writer. And having something this dramatic and this easy to learn is just a great opportunity for you to quickly improve your writing. So to that end, let's get started. As always, I've got a little quote for you. This was from a man named Thomas Fuller who died a long, long time ago. But he had this to say: "He who cures a disease may be the skillfulest, but he that prevents it is the safest physician." And I love this quote when it comes to learning new things about writing and being able to implement it in your writing and make your writing just better. Because eventually that's what's going to happen. If you keep working at your craft, if you keep pushing yourself as a writer, if you keep really understanding how to use English grammar to become a more dynamic, more immersive, better writer, it's going to show in your writing. And your fans are going to start to realize it. And you're going to pick up more fans because you're not going to lose the pickier readers because you're doing things correctly. But the million-dollar question is, what is filtering? And that's a great question to ask, especially if you've never heard this term before. To understand filtering means to understand sentence structure. Yes, it means we're going to talk a lot about grammar today, because I love grammar. Hopefully you can hear the sarcasm in my voice. But really, what are we? We are professional story creators. We are professional prose writers, and prose is grammar.
Just a short interruption to tell you about a great deal. If you're enjoying Drake and his brutal teaching in this video, you'll love his new online course, Stronger Story Narratives for Writers and Authors. And if you act soon, you can purchase lifetime access at 50% while we're putting on the polishing touches. So go to drakeu.com/half off and use the code BRUTAL50. It's that easy. Now, back to Drake and his wonderful discussion.
So you have to push yourself in grammar. You have to push yourself understanding English and being able to put sentences together correctly so that your readers get the most out of what they read. So to that end, let's diagram some sentences. Yep, that's right. We're going to go back to 3rd grade, Miss Johnson's class, where she used to hit me over the knuckles with a ruler because I didn't understand diagramming sentences back then. But that's okay, I'm much older now and I definitely understand diagramming sentences, especially simple ones like the example that we're going to use right now, which is, "The dog bit the boy." Very simple sentence. So if we diagram this sentence and we take a look at what makes it up from a sentence structure standpoint, we see that the subject of the sentence is the dog. And the action being performed by the subject is bit. So the dog is our subject and bit is our action. The boy is just the recipient of it. Now I use this same example when I'm talking about active voice versus passive voice, and that's exactly what this is. This is an active voice sentence. And we know it's active voice because the subject of the sentence is doing the action. The dog is biting. So it's active voice. Just for giggles, let's take a look at the same sentence but written in passive voice. By flipping around, we now have the boy was bitten by the dog. So again, let's diagram it. Now the subject of the sentence is the boy, and the action being performed by the boy is was bitten. But what did the boy do? Nothing. He's passive. Therefore, it's a passive voice sentence. When the subject of your sentence is not doing the action, you're writing in passive voice. And we as American prose writers should never write in passive voice. The general rule is you should write less than 2% passive voice. Me personally, I rate less than 0.2% passive voice. Why? Simple. I don't write a passive voice sentence in anything that I write unless I want it to be there, by choice and by design. But why would I want a passive voice sentence in one of my pieces of work? Simple. I need to write a sentence, but I don't want the reader to know who did the action. So the beautiful thing about passive voice sentences is we can lose the noun that's actually doing the action. In other words, we could write the boy was bitten. This is a complete sentence. We have the boy, which is the subject. We have the action, was bitten. But we don't know who bit the boy. It could have been a dog. It could have been a spider. It could have been his little sister. We just don't know. So every time I personally write a passive voice sentence, it is by design and on purpose, because I need to write a sentence that gives the reader some information, but I do not want to give them all the information. So I would never write the boy was bitten by the dog, because all the information is there and it's passive voice. If I'm going to do that and all the information is there, I'm going to flip it around and write an active voice sentence. The dog bit the boy. So how does this relate to filtering? Well, it relates perfectly, because filtering is all about forcing the reader to focus on what you want them to focus on. And in the case of sentence structure, that means the subject of the sentence. So if I write the dog bit the boy, then the focus of the sentence, the subject, is the dog, and the reader focuses on the dog. And since the action is being done by the focal point of the sentence, the reader is immersed into that action. Flipping that around to the boy was bitten by the dog, now the subject of the sentence becomes the boy, which means the focus of the reader is focused on the boy. But the boy's not doing anything. The boy is passive. It's one of the reasons why passive voice sentences are so terrible to write willy-nilly in your prose. Only write them when you actually want them written. But it's equally important when we're talking about filtering. Because to understand filtering is to understand what we want our readers to focus on. So case in point, let's say we have the sentence, I could feel the demon's hot breath licking the back of my neck. Now that's kind of an eerie sentence. And the worst thing is when you read it, you're like, well, there's nothing wrong with that. It's fine. It's not. It's terrible. Don't do this. Why? Because what is the focus? I could feel. So what I'm forcing the reader to do is focus on me, the point of view character, the narrator. Am I the important part of this sentence? Am I what I want my readers to focus on? No, not in this sentence. I want them focusing on something completely different. The demon's hot breath licked the back of my neck. Now we are really creepy, because what is the subject of the sentence? The demon's hot breath. What do we want the reader to focus on? The demon's hot breath. By this one simple change, this elimination of the filtering, we make the story more immersive for the reader. And this is a great example of why this is called filtering. We are filtering the story through the narrating character. So if I write, I could feel the demon's hot breath, what I'm doing is I'm filtering the event that's going on through the narrating character. I'm forcing the reader to watch the story through the eyes of the narrator instead of just experiencing it for themselves. When I eliminate the filtering and just go, the demon's hot breath licked the back of my neck, I am no longer filtering the story through me, the point of view narrator. Instead, I'm allowing the reader to experience it for themselves, which makes for a much more dynamic and immersive and enjoyable read for the reader. When you're reading it for the first time, when it has that filtering in it, it doesn't seem wrong to you. To write, I could feel, is natural. It seems fine. It's pushing yourself to understand that we don't want the reader to be filtered through that narrator if we don't need it. We want the reader to experience things for themselves. Which is why the line, the demon's hot breath licked the back of my neck, is so much more immersive for the reader. So what we want to do is we want to avoid filtering words. And I'm not going to read this whole list, but it really comes down to the senses. Sight, hearing, tasting, smelling. These are the ones that get overused the most as filtering words. And those are the ones that you really want to pay attention to and really watch out for in your writing. But it doesn't just have to be the physical stuff. It can be the mental stuff too. Case in point, the line, Drake wondered what it would feel like to fall to his death. Again, we are filtering the story through Drake's imagination, as opposed to just allowing the reader to experience it. Now with this, we could get really crazy and go in depth in what it feels like and looks like to wonder what it feels like to fall to your death. So to that end, we might write something like, Drake's imagination ran wild, the wind rushing past him, whipping his clothing into a tangled frenzy. The sight of the ground racing up to meet him, its sole desire to crush every bone in his body, the terror and ecstasy of his last few breaths of life. Now this is getting into a whole bunch of things that cross over into my show versus tell classes, but my point is still valid here. If we're not going to filter this thought through our narrator, then we're going to have to show it. We're going to have to elaborate on it. The coolest thing is when you do stuff like this, you really expand upon the character and give the reader an insight into what that character is and what type of character that is. And in this case, Drake is bat crazy. Anybody who's excited about falling to their death and that becomes kind of a euphoric thought to them is not the sanest of person. And if this is the character that we're trying to convey to the reader, then by doing something like this and elaborating on it, we're really going to build that insight in for our reader, which is a great thing for the reader and the immersion of the story. So let's go deeper and let's look at some examples of filtering and some possibilities for correcting them. So we could write, I watched as the ghost floated down the hall toward me. But again, what is the subject? I am the subject. So what is the reader going to focus on? I. But is that the important part of this sentence? No, that's not the important part of the sentence. The ghost is the important part of this sentence. So we don't want to filter the reader through the narrator in this instant. Much better to write, the ghost floated down the hall toward me. And really it depends on the paragraph that this is attached to, whether you even need to add toward me or not. You may get away with the ghost floated down the hall. It really just depends on the paragraph that surrounds it at that point. But do you see how much more dynamic and immersive this sentence is now? You read the first one and you're like, that's not bad. I would write something like that, but it is bad. And with a simple little fix, we can make it so much better. Drake looked at the policeman who had his gun pointed toward him. Again, now we're forcing the reader to look at Drake. But is Drake the important part of this sentence? No. The policeman had his gun pointed at Drake. See, that's so much more dynamic, so much more interesting to read. I heard the monster's claws ripping up the ground as it gave chase. So you read it and it sounds good. But unfortunately, what is the focus point of the sentence? I again. Is that the important thing that we want the reader to focus on? No. The monster's claws ripped up the ground as it gave chase. Just so much more dynamic, so much more interesting for the reader and more immersive for the reader. And it really is just a simple little change. Drake could feel the knife slice into his arm. Do we want the reader to focus on Drake feeling this, or do we want the reader to focus in on the act of the knife slicing? Me personally, I like, the knife sliced into Drake's arm. I would follow that up with what it feels like to have a knife slice into your arm. But again, I wouldn't filter that feeling through Drake. I would just give that feeling directly to the reader so that they get immersed in that event and that feeling and that emotion and that pain and the agony, whatever it is I want them to experience during this moment. Now with those examples, I used a lot of sight and sound, which are the two most common forms of filtering. But remember, all the senses can be filtering, including even the thinking and emotions, depending on how they're written within the sentence. So here's one with smell. Drake could smell the vileness of the creature as it slithered closer. We're still filtering. We're still filtering it through Drake. Drake is smelling because that's the subject and the action. All the other stuff is superfluous. But we don't want it to be. We want it to be center stage. So we're going to write that sentence different. A thick stench wafted off the creature as it slithered closer. The reader's going to get caught up in that. They're going to be immersed in it. They're going to enjoy the read so much more than that crappy filtering of the sentence before it. So let's look at some examples of how we can fix some of this crappy filtering that's in our writing. So let's say we have the line, Drake watched the rabid dog creep closer. Now, obviously this scene is already set up. So we already know there's a rabid dog. We already know, the whole 9 yards. This sentence is just moving the dog closer to our point of view character. But again, there's no reason to force the reader to focus on Drake because the dog is the important thing. So a lot of time in filtering, you can literally just cut off the filtering and the sentence still works perfectly. The rabid dog crept closer. Yeah, I changed the verb to make it work, but still, you get the point. We're just cutting off the filtering, eliminating Drake watched, and the sentence works fine. A lot of times you'll find that is the case with your filtering. You'll be able to literally just cut off the I looked, I saw, I heard, I smelt, whatever, John heard, John saw, John smelled. You'll just be able to cut it right off the beginning of the sentence, and voila, filtering is fixed. And this is probably the number one way you're going to fix filtering. A lot of times you're just going to chop the first couple of words off of a sentence that has filtering in it, and the sentence will still work. Maybe you have to adjust a verb, but for the most part, the sentence will work intact. And that's really nice. You'll just cut off I looked, I saw, I heard, I gazed, I smelled, or John smelled, John saw, John gazed, John looked, John smelled, whatever. Those are the first couple of words in your sentences, and the entire sentence has everything it needs to be a complete sentence after that. So it's a very simple little snip, gone, filtering out of the way. The sentence is so much more dynamic, so much more enjoyable for the read, so much more immersive for the story. And it really is that simple on a lot of your filtering, just to chop it right out, and voila, you now have a much more immersive, more active sentence. Sometimes it's as simple as just kind of flipping the POV toward the end. So here's an example of second person. You look down the hall and see Drake. We can flip that around, throw the narrator to the end of it, and make it a more active sentence. Drake walks down the hall toward you. Again, what do we want the reader focusing on? Do we want the reader focusing on you, or do we want the reader focusing on Drake? And that's the key. It's just understanding what we want the reader to focus on and making sure that we construct the sentence in a manner that the reader is focusing on what we want them to focus on. A lot of time filtering happens in compound sentences because you feel you need to start it out with the point of view characters so that everything else makes sense. I see the knife lying on the table and I pick it up. I've read a variation of this line billions of times, but really we don't need it. We can chop it up into a couple different sentences and just make it a little bit more dynamic. The knife lays on the table. I pick it up. But wait, Drake, you say, the second sentence is filtering. Yes, it is. I've never said don't filter. I said make sure that your sentences are designed so that your reader focuses in on what you want the reader focusing in on. So in the first sentence, I want the reader focusing on the knife. The knife lies on the table. Mr. Reader, look at the knife. The second sentence, I want the reader focusing on the narrator. I pick it up. Mr. Reader, I focus on me here. I'm picking up a knife. The knife is not important at that point in that sentence other than the fact that it's being acted upon. Who's acting upon it is the important thing. Another way to fix filtering is to look for ways to change it into another type of writing. In other words, all the examples that we use so far are all narration. But there are other types of writing. There's inner monologue, there's dialogue. Are there ways to change what you're writing so that it's more dynamic and more showy and still have the reader focus on what you want them to focus on? And so hopefully now you're seeing how easy it is to just pay attention to the filtering and just cut it out. It weakens your story, it weakens your writing. It's not as dynamic, not as immersive. However, as I've already said, I'm not saying don't use filtering because sometimes you need to filter because it's not about not using it all the time. It's about understanding what you want the reader to focus on and forcing that reader to focus on what you want them to focus on. The important part of that sentence, every sentence in your entire manuscript. Case in point, we might have a section like this in our story. I'm sorry, Drake, but we can't be together any longer, Dylan said as he stood. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I watched as Dylan slowly walked away, my heart aching. So in this instance, in that second sentence, it's all about the narrator. It's all about their feelings, their emotions, and we absolutely want the reader focusing on the narrator through this moment of his story. So we're going to write stuff like I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I watched as Dylan. Dylan standing and leaving is not the important part of that sentence. Drake watching him go, heartbroken. That's the important part of that sentence. And since that's what I want the reader to focus on, that's going to become the subject of my sentence for that specific instance. Again, sentence structure is all about understanding what we want the reader to focus on and then making sure that the reader focuses on that. All right, so I've thrown a bunch of examples at you to kind of show what I mean by filtering. But those examples were all single lines. They were created kind of on the fly just to help me illustrate my points as we kind of went through there. But I think you should also look at this in action. So to that end, let's look at some of my own writing. Two pieces from two different stories. Initially, we'll look at a first-person piece. The narrator is an 18-year-old girl, and it's set in a modern-day city. Then we'll look at a third-person piece from one of my epic fantasy stories, and you'll see that filtering can be rampant in both types of versions. And then we'll also look at them fixed. Really what I did was I just took my writing and then butchered it with a bunch of filtering because I don't write filtering. So we're really going to look at the edited piece first and then the unedited piece second because I don't write with filtering. But let's take a look at that first-person piece now. I was chilly even though it was August. I stood in the deserted street, gazing up at the sun as it slid down toward the horizon. I guessed it was about 3 in the afternoon. I looked across the road and saw Jack's Cafe. I could see that it was an ancient rust-colored brick building with a stained red and white striped awning, but I couldn't pull my eyes off the eerie wooden statue sitting beside its front door. What the hell was that thing even supposed to be? An Indian? An old white man? A child molester? I really had no idea. Still, the windows promised old-fashioned shakes and malts as well as awesome burgers and fries, and since I hadn't eaten a thing since early that morning, they had my full attention. So we read through that, and it reads fine. Nothing jumps out at you where you're like, oh, this is terrible writing. But it is terrible writing. It's horrid. And it's all because of the horrid, crappy filtering that's just littered throughout this story. 7 to be exact. I was chilly. I stood. I guessed. I looked. I could see. I couldn't pull my eyes. I really had. All things where I'm filtering and forcing my reader to watch the story through the POV. As a side note, when you're writing in first person, you really want to try to cut out every I that you can possibly cut out of your story. You can't cut them all out because I is your #1 pronoun that you can use in a first person story, but you do want to pay attention to them and cut them all out. The cool thing is a lot of times it's all just crappy filtering. So now let's look at the original way that I wrote this and see how I don't use filtering, or we can equate it to watching how these filtering got fixed. It was chilly even though it was August, and the street sat deserted even though it was about 3 in the afternoon. Across the road from me stood Cafe Jack's, an ancient rust-colored brick building with a stained red and white striped awning. An eerie wooden statue slumped beside its front door. What the hell was that thing even supposed to be? An Indian? An old white man? A child molester? I really had no idea. Still, the windows promised old-fashioned shakes and malts as well as awesome burgers and fries. And since I hadn't eaten a thing since early that morning, they had my full attention. Notice how much more smooth this reads, and how much more inviting it is to the reader to immerse themselves in what they're reading. And we did a lot. First of all, there's no reason to say I was chilly, because if it was chilly, then it's affecting the point of view character. There's no reason to say that I'm looking up the street. I can just say that the street sat empty. And I don't have to think about what time it is. I can literally just tell the reader what time it is. Now, this first sentence has some points of contention. There's a lot of wases in it, and that's something I'll talk about in a later video. But really, the quick answer is, a lot of times when I'm doing narration, I just want to get through it quickly. So I don't mind it being a little telly, as long as I'm not filtering it through the POV, and as long as it still feels immersive and feels personal to the POV. So while some of you may be reading that going, wow, there's a lot of wases, that's terrible writing, great, fine. But it's just a piece of description about a brick building. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time trying to make it dynamic, because it's not an important element of the story. And again, moving down to the statue, I don't need to say I fixated on it, or I looked at it, or I saw it, because everything that's seen is seen by the narrator. So I can just write it, an eerie wooden statue slumped beside its front door. The only person that's seeing that is the narrator, and I don't need to filter the reader through it. I can just give the eerie statue to the reader. Now notice we still have one piece of filtering. I really had no idea. But again, what's the important part of that sentence? I don't know what that statue is. So I'm cool with allowing the reader to focus on I in that sentence, because it's the important part of that sentence. But notice we went from 7 to 1. Also notice there's only one sentence in this entire thing that starts with the word I. Now there is a second one down there toward the bottom, second from the bottom, where it says, and since I hadn't eaten. But I've made a compound sentence out of that and put it into the second half of that sentence. So the subject is still the building, the windows, what the windows say, and so on and so forth. Yes, I absolutely could chop them up and do something else, but again, this is narration. I'm trying to get through this as quickly as possible, and I do tend to write some run-on sentences when I'm in narration mode, because it's narration. Let's just get through the description. Let's move forward into the important part, which in this scene is going to be her sitting in this cafe talking to someone. And that I'm going to write much different. All right, let's move into a third-person piece and see how filtering affects that. Have I sworn allegiance to the just, or simply to the victorious? Valamain chewed his lips as this question clawed at his mind. He passed his gaze over the imposing group assembled in a loose circle beneath the Temple of Wisdom. Including himself, there was 10 in total. He looked over at Tyle, the person he was to protect. Can the righteousness of our cause truly cleanse my soul of what I've done this day? Valamain could not say. He swallowed hard, trying to clear the bile resting in the back of his throat. He ached to scratch at the soot and ash congealing beneath his armor. It exasperated the dark clouds saturating his thoughts. He passed his gaze over those in attendance. They stood around a central sending stone. He strained to hear what they said as they spoke in hushed whispers. They were waiting. I hate waiting. So again, you read through this and it reads fine. I've read this type of writing a million times. But it's not. It's horrid. I actually struggled reading that. My brain kept screaming at me to edit it and cut it out. The reason? 11 filterings. Have I? Valamain chewed. He passed his gaze, including himself. He looked. Valamain could not. He swallowed. He ached. He passed. He strained. I hate. I'm forcing the reader to look at my narrator constantly throughout this piece. But there's so much cool stuff in this one little piece. Why would I waste it by forcing the reader to look at the narrator through the entire thing? And again, I read this time and time and time and time again in aspiring writers' works. Because when you read through it, it reads fine, but it doesn't. It's weak. So let's take a look at it the way I originally wrote it and see if it's an improvement. Have I sworn my allegiance to the just or simply to the victorious? This question clawed at Valamain Dre's mind as he passed his gaze over the imposing group assembled in a loose circle beneath the Temple of Wisdom, 10 in total, including himself and Tyle. Can the righteousness of our cause truly cleanse my soul of what I've done this day? He could not say. The bile resting in the back of his throat was less ambiguous. Soot and ash congealed in his sweat, conspiring to irritate the skin beneath his armor. It exasperated the dark clouds saturating his thoughts. Those in attendance stood around a central sending stone and spoke in hushed whispers. Waiting. I hate waiting. So, cut out a lot of the filtering. In fact, cut out all of them but 2. Have I? He could not. And in both of these, they're sentences where I want the reader to focus on the narrator. Have I sworn allegiance? I'm questioning myself, the narrator. Therefore, that's what I want the reader to focus on. Him questioning himself. He could not say. He's answering the question of his own inner monologue. And that's exactly what I want the reader to focus on. But everything else is gone. That opening question is what's clawing at Valamain's mind. So I want the reader to focus on the opening question. Notice he's still passing his gaze, but it's not filtering because it's not the subject of the sentence. Yes, I cheated. I put it as a compound sentence. The question is clawing at his mind at the same time as he's passing his gaze over the scene. But again, we're talking narration here. I'll cheat a little bit in narration so that I can just hurry up and get through it and get to the exciting parts. Same thing when we get down to the next paragraph. It's the bile that I want the reader to focus in on. It's the soot and ash and what they're doing that I want the reader to focus on, not the fact that he's dealing with it. By giving it to the reader, I'm giving them the ability to immerse themselves in it and not filter the story through that narrating character. It's just a different way of thinking as you're writing. And that really is the number one thing to understanding filtering. It's understanding that you kind of have to change how you think as a creative writer. Again, those examples were very difficult for me because I don't write that way. I don't write with filtering. So my normal way to write is just to give everything to the reader and only focus in on that POV narrator when I need the reader focusing in on that POV narrator. If I don't need them focusing in on that narrator, then I'm never going to make the mistake of having the reader focus in on that character. And so it is a mind shift, something that you're going to have to do to change your way of thinking as a storyteller. But this is on video. Go back and just pause it and read each one of them without me reading it to you. And you'll notice that the second way is much more immersive, much more dynamic, much more enjoyable to read. Even though really when you read through either one of the versions, they both kind of read fine. One just reads better than the other. And that's the key, becoming a better writer. Writing more dynamic, more immersive stories. And to do that means slicing out your filtering. So as always, thank you for your time, and I hope you learned something. Filtering is not that difficult to understand and to see how it affects your writing. And hopefully now you can start taking a look at your own writing and figuring out ways of cutting that filtering out of your writing. Till next time.